Okay, so remember I told you before in our nervous system, our nerve cells are called neurons, and there's three different types of neurons. There's the sensory neuron, the motor neuron, and the relay neuron. Okay, and the structure looks slightly different in all of them, okay, but they all carry nerve impulses. So the sensory neuron has a long part to it, which we call the axon, and then a shorter part called the dendron, where the nerve impulse goes through from one side to the other. It has this little area that we call the cell body, which would have the normal structure of a cell like we usually used to, with cytoplasm, and it has a nucleus inside. Okay, and it starts at the one end where you have receptors. So the sensory neuron would be in all your sense organs. So for example, your skin and your fingertips, your eyes, things like that. Anytime that we want to be able to sense something. And you would have different types of sensory receptors, like pain receptors, temperature receptors, light receptors. And they would pick up a stimulus and they would send the impulse through that sensory neuron. But it has this coating of a myelin sheath, okay, which is insulating. So this electrical impulse that gets sent through the nerves would jump to the little gaps from one to the next, okay, and that makes a nerve impulse much quicker because there's only a short distance that it needs to travel with having that myelin coating. Then a motor neuron would be similar, but instead of having a long area of a dendron, it has what we call dendrites, which are lots of little extensions from the cell body, which also has the nucleus inside. And it has that long axon, still covered by a myelin sheath, so that it only has those small areas for the nerve impulse to travel. And then it's traveling from there down towards the effector, which is going to be a muscle, for example, anything that you're going to have a reaction with. And then the relay neuron is just a neuron to connect your sensory to your motor. In between, it's usually found in the spinal cord, and it's much smaller and just connecting your sensory on one side to your motor on the other, still having the cell body and the nucleus in the middle. So then the nerve impulse itself that's traveling, it's only going to be felt when the impulse reaches the brain. Okay, so only when, if you touch something or get cut or hurt or something, you will only realize that that's happened when the impulse reaches the brain, and that's the only time that you would then feel something. So you would feel your pain, cold, heat, anything like that, as soon as it goes from like the tip of your finger where you've touched something all the way through the impulse to the brain. But now that impulse will travel at 100 meters per second. Okay, so you would feel that impulse within milliseconds, okay? Because if it's going 100 meters every second, and it only needs to travel like a meter from the tip of your finger to your brain, you're going to get there very fast. So you actually don't even realize the small, tiny time lapse by the time you feel pain. And that's why it feels instant. If you prick yourself or cut yourself, that you instantly feel that pain. So the impulse will travel from a sensory neuron to a relay neuron, and then to the motor neuron, where you're going to have an effect for something. So now between those neurons, they have to be connected, but they don't actually ever touch. Okay, so a sensory neuron does not touch the end of the relay neuron, which does not touch the end of the motor neuron. There's tiny little gaps in between them, and the gaps are called the synapses. So a synapse is a junction between two neurons, okay? And a nerve impulse has to pass through a synapse to move from one neuron to the next. So if this side is my one neuron, and on this side is my other neuron ending, there's a gap in the middle that we call the synaptic gap or a cleft. And this whole thing, from the one end of the neuron to the other, including the synaptic cleft or gap, is my synapse. So now we have our electrical nerve impulse, okay? And when I talk about an electrical impulse, it's caused by a change in ions having different charges, okay? So usually sodium and potassium, which is Na plus and K plus in different amounts, and the different charge numbers would then cause that electrical impulse, okay? So think about chemistry, but you don't have to know the specifics of that. But that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the electrical impulse. So now that impulse moves from the one side of the neuron, and now it has to cross this gap. And it's going to do that by having a whole bunch of chemical substances on the one end of the neuron. And those are going to leave in a vesicle. So you get a tiny little vesicle coming from the cell membrane that contains some of that chemical, and that moves across the gap till it gets to the other side. And then there's receptors on this side, which will then trigger the next nerve impulse. So these little chemicals that travel from the one end to the next in the vesicle, we call the neurotransmitters. So now your neurotransmitters are your chemicals that you have, such as dopamine and substances like that you may have heard of before, okay? And those are what need to cross to make the junction between the one to the next. And if there is no neurotransmitters, you cannot continue that neural pathway, and then it just stops. So any substance that affects your neurotransmitters will have an effect on your body. So for example, some toxins, like if you get infected by tetanus, for example, what happens is it breaks down all these vesicles and these substances, and it stops the transmission of the nerve impulse. And that's how it can then break down, and you end up with muscle spasms and lockjaw. And if it happens close to the heart, you can end up with heart failure. So anything that affects these neurotransmitters. It's also how some stimulant drugs have an effect. So for example, heroin would stimulate your receptors in your brain with your neurotransmitters and release a large amount of dopamine, which would then give you that short-lived feeling of a high. Okay, but as soon as the neurotransmitters break down and the dopamine leaves, then that goes away. Okay, so it's a very, very careful balance of how many neurotransmitters you release. And releasing those are what then triggers all those nerve impulses, and especially in the brain, but all the way through the body. You have those happening, and in different parts of the body, you have a different neurotransmitter. Okay, you can have acetylcholine, and like I said before, dopamine. There's lots and lots of different ones. So that's how our stimulus gets triggered, and it moves across all the different nerve cells or neurons. But now, once those impulses start, okay, it can either be triggered by voluntary actions, which are going to start in your brain, and you are making a conscious decision to do something, and it's not going to be automatic. So, for example, if you see something on the ground and you decide that you want to pick it up, the impulse is going to start from your brain once you've decided to do that, then travel through your motor neurons to, for example, your arm muscles, which would then move out and pick up the item that you want to do. Those are all voluntary. You also have involuntary actions, which are going to be your reflexes. So now a reflex is an automatic response to something, and it does not involve the brain. Okay, you will realize that it's happened only after that's occurred. So a reflex is going to occur. So for example, if you prick your finger, you are going to move your arm away from it via your reflex, because a reflex is usually for a protective function, okay, because your body needs to protect itself. So examples of some reflexes are the closure of your iris. So your iris is in your eye, okay, and it's going to close and get smaller, get larger, so that your pupil gets smaller if, for example, you go out into very bright light, and that's going to then protect all the receptors in your eye. Or if you touch something sharp or hot, you automatically move your hand away, okay? Or if you have something lodged in your trachea, you are going to cough to get rid of it. Those are all examples of reflexes. Or the knee-jerk reaction. So if you bang your knee in a certain part, it's going to move your leg, okay, so that you would be kicking something away that is then bothering your knee. Okay, all of those different things are reflexes. And they occur by what we call the reflex arc. Okay, so now a reflex arc is just the process of that impulse flowing from a sensory neuron through the relay neuron to the motor neuron before your brain has made a conscious decision to do that. Okay, so if we look at a diagram of a reflex arc, okay, it's going to look something like this. So there's a hand, okay, and it's going to be pricked in the finger by a pin. So that's going to be the pin, okay, and then at the tip of the finger or foot or whatever it is, you are going to have a sensory receptor. Okay, so now the receptor picks up that you have been pricked by that pin, and an impulse is going to travel along through all the way through the sensory neuron, carrying on into the spinal cord, okay, because this is the spinal cord. Through from one to the next, through the gap, which is going to be the synapse that I just explained to you, into the next neuron, which is going to be our relay neuron in the spinal cord. Okay, and then through another synapse down to the next one, which is going to be your motor neuron. All the way until it ends up at a muscle, which would be the effector. Okay, in this case it's a muscle. Doesn't necessarily have to always be a muscle. It depends on what the reflex is. And that is then going to cause you to move your hand away. Now, as soon as that impulse travels into the spinal cord, it then sends another impulse up to the brain, and that is when the brain realizes what is happening, but at the same time, it's already sent the impulse straight to the muscle and you've moved your arm away. Okay, so by the time you realize that it's actually happening, you have already moved your arm, and then you realize that that was something that was painful. Okay, so a sequence of events in a reflex arc is going to be as follows. You are going to have a stimulus. Okay, so that could be anything. Like I said, this example is specifically of a pin, but don't forget there is lots of other reflexes that can occur. From the stimulus, okay, it's going to reach a receptor. So that's the thing that's going to pick up the stimulus. That receptor is going to send the impulse through the sensory neuron. Okay, from the sensory neuron, it is going to move to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord we call a coordinator. Okay, because that is the one that's going to carry on with the impulse as well as send it to the brain. So that we're going to call spinal cord. Okay, from there, it's going to send the impulse through a motor neuron, which would end up going to an effector. Okay, which would then cause a response. And then after that's occurred, the impulse reaches the brain. And from there, you make a decision about what to do once you've realized what has occurred. Okay, so then the other thing that we need to look at once we know these sequence of events, okay, and we're able to label these, a few extra labels that I want you to also know to be able to add is over here, okay, where the sensory neuron goes in, you can see it's in quite a large area, okay? This part of the spinal cord we call the dorsal root, okay? And you can see it's quite much larger than the side with the motor neuron, specifically because it consists of a lot of your cell bodies, and we call it the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, Ganglion. Then the side where the motor neuron comes out of the spinal cord, on that side, that is called the ventral root. Okay, because this is the way that those are situated in your body, one facing forward and one facing back, and that's why we call it the dorsal and the ventral roots. Okay, and then in the spinal cord, okay, you can see that on the inside there's an area that's darker than on the outside. The outside part, where there's nothing, we call the white matter. Okay, the inside part we call the gray matter. And that would be the same in your spinal cord as well as in your brain. It consists of white matter and gray matter. Okay, and the white matter is because that is where we have all the nerve fibers. Okay, and our nerve fibers would be these long parts of our nerves, as well as in our relay neuron. The gray matter area is where we are going to have all of our cell bodies. Okay, so our white matter is where we have our nerve fibers, and our gray matter is where we have the cell bodies in there, and that's what makes them the color that they are, because the cell bodies show up darker than the nerve fibers. Okay, so that is all we need to know about nerves. As long as you can label a reflex arc, know the sequence of events, as well as what happens in a synapse, that's everything that we need to know.